The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a credit card bill and a pizza coupon, as if the universe had no sense of occasion. Daniel Mercer almost threw it away. He was 34 years old, 3 months behind on rent, and surviving on instant noodles and the faint hope that his freelance graphic design business would somehow turn itself around before his landlord lost patience entirely. He was not a man who expected good news. He was not a man who expected any news at all, really. He was the kind of person the world seemed to have simply forgotten about. But the envelope was thick. Cream-colored. The kind of envelope that costs more than $1 just to buy. His name was written on the front in precise, old-fashioned cursive, Mr. Daniel James Mercer, and in the upper left corner, there was a return address from a law firm he had never heard of. Whitmore and Associates. Estate Law. Charleston, South Carolina. Daniel stood at his apartment mailbox for a long moment, turning the envelope over in his hands. Then he went upstairs, made himself a cup of coffee that tasted like regret, and sat down at his kitchen table to read. The letter was formal. Precise. The language of lawyers who charged $400 an hour and wanted you to know it. But the meaning, stripped of its legalese, was simple. His great-uncle, a man named Elias Mercer, had died 3 weeks ago at the age of 89. Daniel had never met Elias Mercer. He hadn't even known the man existed. His own father had been estranged from his family for decades, and Daniel had grown up believing he had no relatives left in the world. But apparently, he did. Or rather, he had. And Elias Mercer, in his last will and testament, had left everything to Daniel. The everything in question was a house. A large old house on the outskirts of a small town called Harlow Creek, in the mountains of western North Carolina. The letter described it as a historic property of significant architectural value, which Daniel translated as old and probably falling apart. There was also a modest sum of money, $12,000, which Elias had left specifically for the maintenance and upkeep of the property. At the bottom of the letter, below the lawyer's signature, there was a handwritten note. Not typed. Handwritten, in the same precise cursive as the envelope. Daniel read it twice before he understood that it had not been written by the lawyer. It had been written by Elias himself. Sometime before he died. Daniel, it read. I know we've never met. That's my fault, and I'm sorry for it. There are things about our family that your father didn't want you to know, and for a long time, I thought he was right to keep them from you. But the house needs a Mercer. It has always needed a Mercer. Please come. Please take care of it. And whatever you do, whatever happens, do not sell it. The house must stay in the family. You'll understand why when you arrive. Your great-uncle, Elias. Daniel read the note a third time. Then he looked around his tiny apartment. The water stain on the ceiling, the radiator that clanked like a dying robot every night, the stack of unpaid bills on the counter, and made the only logical decision available to a man with nothing left to lose. He started packing. He drove the 11 hours from Cleveland to North Carolina in his aging Honda Civic, with 2 suitcases, his laptop, and a box of art supplies crammed into the back seat. The drive was fine until he hit the mountains, and then the fine became something else entirely. The GPS lost signal somewhere on Route 221, just as the road began to climb in earnest. The trees thickened on either side. Old growth, massive oaks and hemlocks whose branches met overhead and turned the afternoon light into something green and strange. Daniel drove by instinct, following a series of handwritten directions that the lawyer's assistant had emailed him, printed out on a single sheet of paper. Turn left at the fork after the Harlow Creek sign. Follow the road for 6 miles. You'll see a mailbox shaped like a barn. Turn right. The house is at the end of the lane. Simple enough. Except that when Daniel turned left at the fork, he almost immediately felt something change. He couldn't have explained it rationally. The air through his cracked window seemed different, cooler, with a faint undertone of something he couldn't identify. Something earthy and old. Like soil that had never seen sunlight. He told himself it was just the mountains. Harlow Creek itself was small, smaller than he'd expected. A single main street with a gas station, a diner, a hardware store, and a post office that looked like it had been built in 1940 and never updated. A few dozen houses spread back from the main street into the surrounding trees. A white church at the end of the block with a parking lot that was, at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, completely empty. He stopped at the gas station to fill up. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, somewhere in his 60s, with a beard that needed trimming and eyes that needed nothing at all. They were flat and watchful, the eyes of a man who had learned long ago that most information was better kept than shared. New in town, the man said. It wasn't really a question. Just passing through, Daniel said, then corrected himself. Actually, I'm moving here. I inherited a house. Out on, he checked his directions. Elm Hollow Road? Something happened to the man's face. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a micro-expression that lasted only half a second before his flat, careful blankness reasserted itself. But Daniel was a visual person. He noticed things. He was trained to notice things. Mercer Place, the man said. That's right. Did you know my great-uncle? Everybody knew Elias. A pause. The man slid Daniel's change across the counter without looking at him. You staying long? I'm not sure yet. Daniel pocketed his change. Is there anything I should know about the property? Any issues with that? House has been empty since Elias passed, the man said. His tone was perfectly neutral. The tone of a man saying something that sounded like information but contained none. 3 weeks now. You'll probably want to get the utilities sorted. Right. Thanks. Daniel left. He sat in his car for a moment in the parking lot, watching the gas station attendant through the window. The man had already turned away and was staring at something on his phone, apparently finished with the conversation. But just before Daniel started his engine, he looked up once, just once, and met Daniel's eyes through the glass. And in that single moment, Daniel could have sworn the man's expression wasn't flat at all. It was afraid. Elm Hollow Road was a single lane of cracked asphalt that wound through the trees for exactly 6 miles before it ended at a pair of iron gates, standing open. The barn-shaped mailbox was there, as promised. Red paint faded to pink, the little metal flag rusted in the down position. Beyond the gates, a gravel lane curved through overgrown grounds, past rhododendron bushes gone wild and oak trees of extraordinary size, their roots buckling the gravel in places. And then Daniel saw the house. He stopped the car. He sat very still. He had expected old. He had expected large. He had expected, possibly, a degree of dilapidation. What he had not expected was the specific quality of presence that the house seemed to possess, the way it sat at the end of the lane, not merely as a building but as something more intentional than that. As something that had been waiting. It was 3 stories. Victorian in style, with a wraparound porch, bay windows, and a tower room in the upper right corner that rose above the main roofline. The siding had once been white but was now the gray of old bone. Every window was dark. A massive oak tree stood to the left of the house, its branches so long and heavy they scraped the roof of the second story, and the sound they made in the slight mountain breeze was like fingernails on wood. It was beautiful. Daniel recognized that immediately. Whatever else it was, the house was genuinely beautiful in the way that old, serious things sometimes are beautiful, the way a cathedral is beautiful, not because it makes you feel good, but because it makes you feel small in a way that is somehow appropriate. He drove up to the front, got out, and stood looking at it. The lawyer had mailed him a key, an actual old-fashioned iron skeleton key, the kind you'd expect to find in a museum. It fit the front door perfectly, and the lock turned smoothly, as if it had been recently oiled. The interior smell hit him immediately, dust, and beneath the dust, something woody and resinous, like old cedar chests and pine floors, and the accumulated scent of decades of wood smoke from the two large fireplaces he could see from the entrance hall. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of a house that had been lived in and then had stopped being lived in, but still remembered. Daniel walked through the rooms slowly, taking stock. The ground floor had a large entrance hall, a sitting room, a dining room, a kitchen that had been updated sometime in the 90s, and a study that was lined floor to ceiling with bookshelves, every shelf full. The second floor had 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. The third floor, accessible by a narrow staircase at the back of the house, had 2 more rooms that seemed to have been used as storage. And the tower room, which was accessed by its own small door on the 3rd floor landing, contained nothing at all except a single wooden chair positioned in the center of the floor, facing the window that looked out over the line. The IT was the study that interested Daniel most. He spent an hour there, pulling books off shelves at random, examining them. They were old, many of them very old, and they covered a strange range of subjects: history, architecture, botany, astronomy. And then, toward the back of one of the lower shelves, a cluster of books that stopped him cold. Folklore. Specifically, Appalachian folklore. Ghost stories, hauntings, local legends. And among them, 3 notebooks. Composition notebooks, the ordinary black and white kind, filled with Elias Mercer's precise handwriting. Daniel took the notebooks to the kitchen, put on a pot of coffee using the ancient percolator he found in a cabinet, and began to read. The first notebook was dated 1987. Elias would have been in his 50s then. The first entry read, "I've been in the house for 30 years now, and I think I'm finally beginning to understand it. It isn't haunted. That's not the right word. A haunting implies something left behind, a remnant, an echo. This is something different. This is something that is still very much present. Still very much active. I've started to think of it less as a spirit and more as a tenant. One who arrived before we did, and has simply never left." Daniel set down his coffee cup. He read for 3 hours. The notebooks were not a diary in any conventional sense. They were more like a case file. Methodical, observational, almost clinical in their tone, except for occasional passages where the clinical distance crumbled and something raw and frightened showed through. Elias had moved into the house in 1957, as a young man of 25, when it had been left to him by his own father. He had been warned, he wrote, by his father and by the older residents of Harlow Creek, that the house had what they called a particular nature. He had not, at 25, taken these warnings seriously. He learned to take them seriously. The phenomena were not dramatic, at first. Small things. Objects moved between one glance and the next. Sounds in the night, not footsteps or knocking, the clichés of ghost stories, but subtler things. Breathing. The particular sound of someone sitting down in a chair in an empty room. The sense, walking through certain doorways, that you had just narrowly missed someone going the other way. By the end of his first year, Elias had catalogued dozens of such incidents. He was a rational man trained as an engineer, and he approached the question rationally. He investigated. He ruled out structural explanations, settling, pipes, acoustics. He consulted with 3 different paranormal researchers over the years, none of whom could offer him anything satisfying. He read everything he could find about the history. What he found was this. The house had been built in 1889 by a man named Caleb Whitmore, an ancestor, apparently, of the law firm that now handled the Mercer estate. Caleb Whitmore had been a successful lumber merchant, and he had built the house as a wedding gift for his wife, a woman named Margaret. They had 3 children and lived in the house for 11 years. In 1900, Margaret Whitmore died. The death was recorded as a heart attack. She was 33 years old. Caleb Whitmore sold the house the following year and moved away. He never returned to Harlow Creek. The house passed through 4 more owners over the next 50 years, none of whom stayed longer than 3 years. Elias had found records, local newspaper archives, county documents, letters that hinted at reasons for these departures. One family had left after their eldest son, aged 12, had begun sleepwalking and on 3 separate occasions been found at night standing in the tower room, staring out the window, apparently asleep and unable to be woken. Another owner had written a letter to his brother, which Elias had somehow obtained a copy of, describing a woman who stands in the hallway and looks at me, and when I look back she is gone, but I can still hear her breathing. A woman. Always a woman. Daniel paused on this detail. He flipped forward through the notebook, scanning. Yes. It was consistent. Every account Elias had collected, and there were many, gathered over 30 years of determined research, described a female presence. Not threatening, exactly. Elias was careful about that word. But watchful. Attentive. Interested, in the way that is not quite comfort and not quite menace but something in between. He wrote, I've come to believe that whatever is in this house is not malicious. But I also no longer believe it is harmless. I think that depends on what you bring to it, what you carry inside you. The house amplifies. Whatever you are, it makes you more so. If you are afraid, it makes you more afraid. If you are sad, the sadness becomes unbearable. I have learned to be careful about my emotional state, the way one learns to be careful about open flames around dry wood, and then, in an entry dated 2001, I've started to think about what happens when I'm gone. The house can't be sold. I know that sounds irrational. It's a legal and financial asset, and there's no rational argument for keeping it in a single family's hands. But I've seen what happens to houses like this when they pass out of the family. The presence, whatever it is, becomes unstable. Dangerous. There was an incident in 1952, between when the Harmons left and when my father took possession. 3 months when the house was empty. 3 months, and in that time, 4 people from Harlow Creek went missing. 3 were found eventually. 1 never was. The house needs a Mercer. I don't fully understand why. But I've lived here long enough to know it's true. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat in the kitchen of the house that was now his, in the dark of a North Carolina mountain night, with the sound of the oak tree's branches scraping the roof above him, and thought carefully about what he had just read. Then he went to bed. Not because he was unafraid, but because he was exhausted and had no better option. He dreamed of a woman standing at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep. When he woke in the morning, there was a smell in the room, something faint and sweet, like cedar and old roses, that hadn't been there the night before. In the first week, Daniel tried to be practical. He arranged for the utilities, which had been maintained on a minimal setting. The house was cold but not damaged, the plumbing worked, the old electrical system needed some attention. He hired a local electrician named Roy who came on Thursday, rewired 2 of the bedrooms, and left very quickly, barely speaking. He found a grocery store 20 minutes away in a larger town and stocked the kitchen. He also, gradually, got to know some of the people of Harlow Creek. The woman who ran the diner was named Louise. She was in her early 60s, lean and efficient, with sharp eyes that had seen a great many things and judged most of them. She served Daniel eggs and coffee on his third morning in town and asked him, without preamble, how he was finding the house. "Big," Daniel said. "Quiet. Quiet." Louise refilled his coffee without being asked. "Is that all?" Daniel looked at her. "Should there be something else?" Louise sat down across from him. The diner was empty at this hour, just past 7. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him with the particular directness of a person who has decided to say something and is working up the phrasing. "Elias was a good man," she said. "He was strange, always was, even when he was young. But a good man. He took care of that house. More importantly, he took care of what was in that house." A pause. "He used to say the house was like a dog that would be fine with the right owner and dangerous with the wrong one." "What does the wrong owner look like?" "Someone who's running from something," Louise said. "Someone carrying a lot of grief or guilt. The house feeds on that." Elias was very careful about his own internal state. Very disciplined. She looked at Daniel steadily. "Are you a disciplined person, Mr. Mercer?" Daniel thought about his overdue bills. His failed relationship of 3 years ago that he still thought about every single day. The graphic design career that was quietly dying. The sense, which had become so constant he barely noticed it anymore, that he had somehow gotten off the right track at some point in his early 20s and had never found his way back. "I'm working on it," he said. Louise nodded, as if this was the honest answer she'd expected. "There's something else you should know," she said. "Elias left something for you. Not with the lawyer. With me." She reached into her apron pocket and placed a small envelope on the table between them. "He gave me this about a month before he died. Told me to give it to whoever came to take the house." Daniel opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card, again in Elias's handwriting. "The door at the end of the third-floor hall. The one that looks like a closet. It's not a closet. Do not open it until you understand what the house is. Do not open it until you are ready. And when you do open it, be kind. She has been alone for a very long time." Daniel read this 3 times. "Did he tell you what was behind the door?" he asked. Louise stood up. "Elias didn't tell me anything he didn't think I needed to know." She picked up his empty coffee cup. "You want more?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Please." He found the door that afternoon. It was exactly where Elias had described, at the end of the third-floor hall, past the 2 storage rooms. It looked exactly like a closet door, small, plain, painted the same off-white as the surrounding walls. There was no lock, just a simple brass knob that was slightly cooler to the touch than it should have been. Daniel stood in front of it for a long time. He didn't open it. Elias had said not until you understand what the house is. He didn't understand yet. He was still on chapter 2 of the notebooks. He had a feeling there were things in those pages that he needed to read before he did anything as significant as opening mysterious doors. So he didn't. He turned and went back downstairs, and spent the rest of the afternoon in the study, reading. The second notebook began in 1992 and covered 5 years of increasingly detailed observations. By this point, Elias had lived in the house for 35 years, and the quality of his relationship with its presence had changed noticeably. There was less fear in the entries. More familiarity. The way you write about a difficult neighbor you've learned, finally, how to coexist with. 1 entry, dated September 1994, caught Daniel's attention. She was particularly active last night. I could feel her in the study while I read. That sense of someone standing at the edge of vision, just beyond the lamplight. I've learned not to look directly. If you look directly, she vanishes. But if you keep your attention on your book and let her simply be there, she stays. For hours sometimes. I've begun to find it companionable, in a strange way. I'm a lonely man. I won't pretend otherwise. And whatever she is, she doesn't judge me for it. And later, from 1998. I've been doing some research into Margaret Whitmore. Not the Margaret from the county records, that woman is just a name and a date. I mean the real Margaret, the one who lived in this house. I found her journals in the library of the County Historical Society. She kept detailed journals for all 11 years she lived in the house, and they are remarkable documents. She was a remarkable woman. Educated, at a time when women were not educated. Curious about everything. The journals cover her marriage, her children, her daily life, the house, the town. They cover, increasingly toward the end, her growing awareness of something present in the house with her. Not malevolent, she wrote. Attentive. As if the house itself is watching me, she wrote. As if it wants something from me, but doesn't know how to ask. And then, in her final entry, written 3 days before she died, she wrote something that I've been thinking about ever since. I dreamed last night that I saw myself in the mirror at the top of the stairs, but the reflection was wrong. Not wrong like a nightmare, just subtly, precisely wrong. The reflection was thinner. Older. Tired in the way I feel tired but never let myself look. As if the mirror was showing me the version of myself that lives inside this house, the part of me that is seeped into the walls and the floorboards over 11 years. The part of me that will remain here after I'm gone. I woke from the dream and I wasn't afraid. I was, strangely, at peace. Whatever remains after I am gone, whatever part of me the house has kept, I hope she is not lonely. I hope, someday, someone comes who understands. Daniel set down the notebook very slowly. He sat very still in the old wooden chair. Then he picked up his phone and searched for the Harlow Creek County Historical Society. He called the number and asked, politely, if they had the journals of Margaret Whitmore, who had lived at Elm Hollow Road in the 1890s. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Those journals are here," the woman on the phone said. "But they're marked as restricted. Mr. Elias Mercer placed a restriction on them about 20 years ago. He said they were only to be made available to family members." "I'm his great-nephew," Daniel said. Daniel Mercer. He left me the house. Another pause. "Can you come in tomorrow?" "Yes," Daniel said. "I'll be there." The Historical Society was in the larger town, 20 minutes away, a converted Victorian house with tall ceilings and the quiet, particular smell of old paper. The archivist, a woman in her 40s named Dr. Reeves, met him with a box of notebooks similar to the ones Elias had kept, only older, the covers faded to the color of tobacco. She set him up at a reading table and left him alone. There were 11 journals, one per year. The handwriting was smaller than Elias's, and more fluid, and occasionally very hard to read because the ink had faded or the paper had warped with age. Daniel read carefully, skipping forward when the content was domestic and focusing on the passages that dealt with the house itself, with what Margaret called the quality of the air and the particular attention of the rooms. It was in the 5th journal, 1895, that things became strange. Margaret wrote about a recurring dream. The same dream, over and over, in which she walked through the house she lived in but which was also, somehow, not her house. A version of the house that was emptier and quieter and older, in which she moved without weight or sound and watched the real world, her family, her children, her husband Caleb, from a slight remove, as through glass. "I know this sounds like madness," she wrote. "I assure you I am not mad. I am, if anything, more clear-headed than I have ever been. The dreams are not unpleasant. They are simply strange. And they are becoming less like dreams and more like, I don't know the right word, rehearsals, perhaps. As if some part of me is practicing for something. I in the 7th journal 1897, the dreams intensified. And in the 8th journal, Margaret began to write about something she called the division. I've spoken to the minister about this, obliquely, without giving him enough information to think I'm unwell. He says the soul is indivisible, that it goes where God directs it at death. But I'm not sure he's right. I've been reading about older beliefs, the folk beliefs of these mountains, some of which are very old indeed. There is a notion in certain traditions that a place can hold part of a person. Not the whole soul, not the essential part, the conscious self, but something. A residue. An impression. Like the shape a body leaves in a mattress after years of sleep. What if the house has been taking impressions of me all these years? What if, when I am gone, those impressions remain? What if there is a version of me, not conscious, not truly alive, but not gone either, that will remain in these rooms, in the wood and the plaster and the air, long after my body is in the ground? I find I am not disturbed by this thought. I find, in fact, that it gives me a kind of comfort. The body's death is frightening. But if some part of me remains here, in this house, in the rooms where I have been happy, then death is not entirely an ending. It is a different kind of being. Daniel stopped reading. He looked up at the institutional ceiling of the Historical Society for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the page. The final entry of the 8th journal was dated December 1898, 2 years before Margaret died. I have made my decision. I have, in fact, already made it, without quite realizing I was making it. I have been putting myself into this house for 8 years. My attention, my care, my love for it. And the house has been keeping what I give it. When I die, I will not entirely leave. I will stay here, in the wood and the stone and the air. I will be here for as long as the house stands. I find that I am at peace with this. I only ask one thing of whatever comes after. That someone be kind. That whoever lives in this house after I am gone, whoever inherits it, whoever comes to it by whatever path, that they understand. That they are not afraid. That they simply let me be here, in the house I loved, in the rooms where I was happy. That is not so very much to ask. Is it? Daniel drove back to Elm Hollow Road in the late afternoon light. He parked in front of the house. He sat and looked at it for a long time. Then he went inside. He spent the next 3 days finishing the notebooks. By the end, he understood, or felt he understood, most of what Elias had been trying to tell him. The house was not haunted in the conventional sense. It did not contain Margaret Whitmore's ghost. It contained something that might more accurately be described as the living residue of her attention, the accumulated impressions of 11 years of love and care for a particular set of rooms, a particular set of walls, a particular view out of particular windows. It had no conscious self, no will, no agenda. It was more like a kind of presence. The way a piece of music contains the presence of its composer, or the way a garden contains the presence of its gardener. But it was sensitive to the people who inhabited the house. It responded to emotion the way an instrument responds to touch. And some people who were badly frightened, or deeply grieving, or carrying significant guilt, experienced that resonance in ways that were overwhelming. The house didn't intend to hurt them. It simply made everything louder. Elias had learned, over decades, how to live with this. He had learned to maintain a kind of inner equilibrium, not because he was without feeling, but because he understood the importance of not feeding the resonance with his own fear. He had learned to treat Margaret's presence, because that was how he thought of it, as her presence, with the same courteous, gentle attention one might offer a person who had been through a great deal and deserved to be treated gently. And he had been lonely without her. The last entry of the third notebook was dated 18 months before his death. It was the shortest entry in any of the 3 books. "I'm tired. I've been here long enough. It's time for someone new to come and take this on. I'm not afraid to die. I'm curious, actually, about what I'll find on the other side. But I find I'm sorry to leave her. Whoever comes next, whoever the family sends, I hope they're kind. That's all I've ever hoped. Just kindness. E.M." Daniel closed the final notebook. He sat for a moment in the kitchen with the notebook stacked in front of him and the percolator gurgling on the counter and the mountain light coming through the window at the particular golden angle of late afternoon. Then he went upstairs to the 3rd floor. He stood in front of the plain door at the end of the hall. He breathed. He put his hand on the brass knob, still cooler than it should have been, and opened the door. Behind the door were stairs. Narrow, wooden stairs, going up. Not to a full room, just to a small landing, barely large enough for one person to stand on. At the top of the stairs was a window, and through the window, the view was extraordinary, the whole of the Elm Hollow property spread out below, the lane curving through the trees, the mountains rising beyond, the sky above them enormous and clear and pale gold with late afternoon. It was the most beautiful view Daniel had ever seen. He stood on the landing and looked at it for a long time. And then, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, the way warmth spreads from a fire, he felt it. He could not have described it precisely. It was not visual or auditory. It was more like a quality of the air, a slight change in atmospheric pressure that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the feeling of not being alone, but not in a frightening way. More like the feeling of walking into a room where someone who loves you is sitting, before you've seen them or heard them, when you simply know they're there from some sense you can't name. He didn't look around. He remembered what Elias had written, "If you look directly, she vanishes." He kept his eyes on the view. "Hi," he said. He felt slightly ridiculous saying it. He said it anyway. "I'm Daniel. I'm Elias's great-nephew. He left me the house." A pause. "I read your journals. I read everything you wrote." He paused again, looking at the mountains. "You were extraordinary. Genuinely. The way you thought about things, the way you paid attention to everything. I've never read anything quite like it." The quality of the air changed again. Very slightly. Like a held breath, released. "I'm going to take care of the house," Daniel said. "I promise. I know I'm a mess, I've got a lot of things to figure out, and I'm not Elias, I won't pretend I am. But I'm going to learn. And I'm going to stay." He hadn't known he was going to say that until it came out, but it was true. He felt it settle into him, certain and quiet. "I'm going to stay." He stood at the window for another 20 minutes, watching the light change on the mountains. The presence, her presence, remained. Steady and still and warm in a way that was almost physical. When he finally went back downstairs, the house felt different. Settled. The way a room feels after a long silence has finally been broken. 3 months later, Daniel was a permanent resident of Harlow Creek. He had, to his own considerable surprise, become something like happy. The quiet of the mountains suited him. The work of restoring the house, there was always something to fix, something to maintain, gave his hands something useful to do while his mind worked on the freelance projects that had, somehow, begun to arrive more reliably. Perhaps it was the focus the house imposed. Perhaps it was simply that having a purpose had sharpened him in ways that purposelessness had not. He became known in town. Louise became something like a friend. The gas station attendant, whose name was Frank, eventually started nodding at him. Small victories. And the house was fine. The presence was present, as Elias had described, but manageable. On good days it felt companionable. On bad days he simply reminded himself to breathe, to stay even, not to feed the resonance with fear. He was doing well. He thought he was doing well. And then, on a Thursday evening in early December, he found the fourth notebook. It was behind a false panel in the back of the bookshelf, a panel he had only discovered because he was reorganizing the shelves and noticed that the measurements didn't quite add up. He pressed, the panel swung open, and inside was a single composition notebook, identical to the other three. On the cover, in Elias's handwriting. Do not read until you are ready. You'll know when. Daniel sat down. His hands were steady. He opened the notebook. The first entry was dated 6 months before Elias died. I'd been putting off writing this for a long time. 20 years, at least. Maybe longer. I kept hoping I'd find a way to make it less. I kept hoping the facts would change if I looked at them long enough. They haven't changed. So here it is. The presence in this house is not Margaret Whitmore. Daniel stopped. Read that sentence again. He kept reading. I know that's what I've told myself for 60 years. I know that's the story I built. Out of her journals, out of the local folklore, out of my own desire for the thing to be benign, to have a simple explanation, to be the kind of story where an unusual phenomenon has an unusual but ultimately harmless cause. But I've known for 20 years that I was wrong. I've simply been too, I don't know. Cowardly, maybe. Attached to the story I'd built. Whatever the reason, I've been lying to myself, and now that I'm dying, I find I can't die with that lie unspoken. The thing in this house is not Margaret Whitmore. I don't know what it is. I've spent 60 years living with it and I still don't know. I know what it does. I know how it behaves. I know that it responds better to kindness and calm than to fear and grief. I know that when the house is empty, it becomes dangerous. I know that it appears to prefer female forms, which is why I always assumed it was Margaret. But Margaret's journals were in the Historical Society for years before I placed restrictions on them. Anyone could have read them. Including, this thought has taken me years to bring myself to think clearly, whatever is in this house. What if the presence read them too? Not literally, I don't mean it sat down and turned pages. But the house absorbs things. It keeps impressions. What if, over the years, as people read Margaret's story and brought their understanding of it back into the house, as I myself spent decades thinking of the presence as Margaret, what if the presence became Margaret? Not because it was always her, but because that was the shape we gave it? What if we told it what it was, and it believed us? I don't know if this matters. I've turned it over and over, and I can't decide if it matters. The presence is what it is, regardless of its origin. It's not malevolent. It keeps the house alive. A Mercer in the house keeps it stable. These things remain true whether the thing is the residue of a 19th century woman's love or something far older and stranger that has simply learned to wear her shape. But I thought whoever came next should know the full truth. Or at least, as much of the truth as I've been able to assemble. Because here is what I've never written down. Here is the thing I've been most afraid of. It learns from us. Whatever it is, it grows from what we bring to it. I've lived here for 60 years, and I've given it 60 years of myself, my attention, my emotion, my way of seeing the world, my loneliness, my care, my love for the books and the study and the view from the tower window and the sound of the oak tree in the wind. When I die, the house will have had 60 years of Elias Mercer. And whatever is in it will have absorbed 60 years of Elias Mercer. It will be more me than it was before. And when the next person comes, when you come, whoever you are, whatever Mercer you are, it will be ready to learn from you too. It will add you to itself. The way the house has been adding to itself for more than 100 years. Layer on layer of the people who loved it. And so here is the thing I need you to understand, the thing I should have understood from the beginning. You are not just inheriting a house. You are inheriting everyone who ever loved it. Be careful what you bring. Be careful who you are. Because whatever you are, the house will make you more so. And when you are gone, what you were will remain. And it will be waiting for whoever comes next. Daniel closed the notebook. He sat for a long time in the study, surrounded by the books that Elias had read and the furniture that Elias had touched and the walls that had absorbed 60 years of a lonely, careful, brilliant man who had loved this place. He felt the presence in the room with him. Warm. Attentive. Patient. He thought about Margaret Whitmore. He thought about Caleb Whitmore, who had sold the house and never come back, and what that choice had cost. He thought about all the families who had come and gone and been unable to stay. He thought about Elias, who had stayed for 60 years and died here and left something of himself behind. He thought about himself. The man he had been 3 months ago, sitting in his tiny apartment in Cleveland, opening a letter that had felt like a message in a bottle. Running from something, Louise had said. Someone carrying a lot of grief or guilt. The house feeds on that. He was carrying grief. He knew it. Had known it for years, the grief of a life that had gone differently than he'd hoped, the slow grief of small failures accumulated. And guilt, yes. The guilt of a man who had not become what he'd wanted to be, who had not taken the chances he should have taken, who had spent years moving sideways when he wanted to move forward. He'd brought all of that into this house. He'd been living with it, here, for 3 months. And the house had been absorbing it. He looked up at the walls. The books. The fireplace. The window where the last of the December light was going gold and then pink and then the particular blue of mountain dusk. He thought, I am going to be in these walls someday. Whatever I am, the house will keep it. And then he thought something he hadn't expected to think. I want what I leave behind to be worth keeping. He stood up. Walked to the window. Watched the last light leave the mountains. Elias, he said quietly, to the room, to the presence, to whatever was listening. I think I finally understand. The air did not respond in any way he could describe. But the quality of the silence changed, the way silence changes when someone who has been waiting a long time for something finally hears it. Outside, the oak tree moved in the wind. Inside, the house was still. And Daniel Mercer, inheritor of old houses and older things, a man who had come here with nothing and found something he hadn't known to look for, made himself a cup of coffee, sat back down in the study, and opened a book. He had a long time, he suspected, to figure out who he was going to be. And the house was willing to wait. On a Tuesday morning in November, a letter arrived at a small apartment in Portland, Oregon. The woman who received it was 28 years old. Her name was Nora Mercer. She was an architect, 3 years out of graduate school, struggling to build her practice and carrying, as most people her age carried, a quiet freight of small disappointments and larger hopes. She almost threw the letter away. The envelope was cream-colored. Her name was written on the front in careful handwriting she didn't recognize. She opened it. Nora, the letter began. I'm your great-uncle Daniel. We've never met. That's my fault, and I'm sorry for it. There are things about our family that I should have told you sooner. But the house needs a Mercer. It has always needed a Mercer. Please come. You'll understand when you arrive. Daniel. Nora sat for a long time at her kitchen table, holding the letter. Then she looked around her apartment. The drafting table covered in unfinished drawings, the coffee cup from this morning still on the counter, the window with its view of gray November sky, and she did what Mercers, apparently, did. She started packing.